celebrating Her Royal Highness Sheikh Musa, who is the pioneer of the Qatar Foundation, who is the originator of this WISE conference, for the work she does for innovation in education, for the contribution she makes, for the inspiration that she gives, and for the change for good that has come about. We politicians, it is said, in the words of Shelley about his mother-in-law, it is said sometimes, we've lost the art of communication, but not, alas, the gift of speech. And it is to the credit of the UN Secretary General that he chose not a politician, but Her Royal Highness Sheikh Musa to be his leading advocate for the Millennium Development Goals, which is what I want to talk about today. And it is also a pleasure to be at this conference on innovation in education and to see the new ideas, the inventions, the new techniques, the new technologies, the new visions that are being put forward. And I congratulate all of you on the changes that you are making. In Britain, it takes a long time for a new institution like WISE to establish itself. In fact, in Britain, we say of a new institution that the first 500 years are always the most difficult. This conference, WISE, has established itself in only 3 years as a global institution, and I think everybody who is part of it should be immensely proud of what is being achieved. Now, when I came here yesterday and listened to the achievements of those people you have awarded this year and have awarded in the previous year for what they are doing to change the world, and yet at the same time I was talking to Faisal Abed, who won the major award this year for what he's doing in Bangladesh, talking to Jimmy Wales, who'll speak later from Wikipedia, talking to Her Royal Highness herself, and could see this huge gap between what we want to do and the transformation that we are actually able to do at the moment. Then I'll be honest with you, I threw away my prepared speech and I decided that I would concentrate on what I believe now is a moment of truth in education. And that is what I want to speak about this morning. You may know of the famous philosopher Einstein. And Einstein decided that he would not only speak about physics later in his life, but speak about the whole state of the world. And he published a book and went around Europe advertising his book by doing regular sessions at different places. And he would be driven around Britain when he was doing the launch of his book by a chauffeur, and he would go from place to place, give a speech, give exactly the same speech, give this pre-prepared speech that was read out by him, and then move on to the next place. And he got bored by doing this, and so actually did his chauffeur as well, who had to sit in the audience and listen. And one night his chauffeur said to him, "Look, I know your speech off by heart by now. You've given it on so many occasions, it's exactly the same speech. Why don't I go up and give the speech and you sit in the audience?" And so David, the chauffeur, was on this occasion to come up and give the speech, and Einstein was there sitting looking like the chauffeur in the audience in front of him. And the speech went exactly to plan. The pre-prepared speech was given because the chauffeur had been able to memorize it by heart. And then it came to a point that hadn't normally happened when Einstein was speaking. The chairman of that night suddenly sprung on the chauffeur that he was going to ask for questions from the audience. And the first question was, what is the relationship between the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics? And here was the chauffeur, David, up on the platform, immediately stumped and not sure what to say. And then he hit on something. He said, "Mr. Chairman, this question is so easy and straightforward that I'm going to ask my chauffeur to come up from the audience and answer the question." Einstein never again gave a prepared speech and always spoke to the occasion. And I want to speak to the occasion today. I think we are at a moment of truth in education. The reason I say this is that we are 11 years from the point at which the whole world came together and made a bold decision that by 2015 it would ensure that every single child in the world was at school. There were pledges made, promises made, plans drawn up, conferences organized, applause given to everyone who made that commitment. And here we now are, 4 years only till that year, 2015. and we find that 67 million of our children are still not going to school. Today they will not go to school, tomorrow they will not go to school, and in future it is unlikely that many of these 67 million children will go to school. And if you look at the rate of progress which has slowed in recent years, and particularly in the last 2 years, on present trends, we will not meet that Millennium Development Goal commitment by 2015. We will not even meet the commitment that every child be at school by 2025. We will not meet it even by 2050. The best and most lucky situation would devise an outcome where perhaps by the year 2100 we might have made that commitment real. And a century is too long for the children of this world to wait for a promise to be delivered. And the reason that I speak out today is I am angry that a pledge and a promise and a plan is now descending into a betrayal for the children of the world. The latest country to be created as a state is South Sudan. It is now the 54th country in Africa, the 193rd country in the world. And people who were there on the border, as refugees crossed into Sudan to make that their homeland, mothers particularly with their children, interviewing them on the border, asking them what their priorities were for this new country. And yes, the mothers talked about famine and about the need for food. And yes, they talked about security and the need for protection. And yes, they talked about housing and the need for shelter. But the most important thing, their priority above all, was they said to people what they needed most of all was that there were finally schools for the children, teachers to teach them, a school that was in the area in which they were going to live. And yet, what is the fact about South Sudan today? 10 million people, and there are only 400 girls in senior school education. You take London, inner London, outer London in the United Kingdom, 10 million people. There are 150,000 girls in senior education. But in South Sudan, there are only 400 girls. The chances of a boy finishing primary school education, 13%. The chances of a girl finishing primary education in South Sudan, 5%. In fact, tragically, a girl has got more chance of dying in childbirth than she has of completing 3 years of education. And this is the tragedy that still is the reality for millions of children around the world. Take Nigeria, a country that is technically oil-rich, but has more than 8 million children who are not at school. But if you look at the distribution of opportunity in Nigeria, in the rural areas, girls, on average, 1 year in education. In the urban areas, boys average 9 years of education. A huge distribution of unfairness in opportunity that has got to be addressed, leaving 5 million girls in Nigeria without the right to basic education, even in the year 2011. And if you were to take this whole, and if I were to say to you that for the first 2 rows, we would establish the right that we would spend, as we do in Britain and America, from the age of 3 to the age of 18, on average $100,000 on your education. Some $1 million, some $500,000, some less than that, but on average $100,000 on your education. And then we were to take people in the rest of the hall, and we were to say to you, yes, we will spend money on your education, but on average, as in a continent like Africa, we will spend only $400 on your education, an average of 4 years primary education. Some may get more spent on them in Africa, some less, but on average only $400 as against $100,000. And then if I said to you there's a group at the back, and they will get no education whatsoever, and they will be deprived forever of the chance of developing their talents, and the lack of opportunity and poverty of one generation will be visited as poverty and lack of opportunity in the next generation, then I believe there would be a riot in this hall if you thought that that was the lot and the fate that you were to be destined to. The inequality of opportunity, that some would have 100,000 spent on them, some would have only $400 spent on them, and others would have just nothing spent on them. Inequality of opportunity visited from generation to generation, and no sign, despite the Millennium Development Goals and our commitments to it, that we are narrowing this gap between the 100,000 spent on a child in Britain and the $400, including aid, spent on a child in Africa. In the 1980s, Olof Palme, the Prime Minister of Sweden, went to see Ronald Reagan at the White House when Ronald Reagan was president. And Ronald Reagan didn't know what to make of someone who was coming as a social democrat, an international development champion from Sweden. And he asked his advisors about this man, Olof Palme, and he said, "Isn't he a communist?" And his advisor said, "No, Mr. President, he's an anti-communist." And Ronald Reagan said, "I don't care what kind of communist he is." and Ronald Reagan asked Olof Palme, this is absolutely true story, "What is it you believe? Do you want to abolish the rich?" And he said, "No, I want to abolish the poor. I want every child in the world to have the chance, a decent chance, of education." Now, when we see a child in pain and suffering, we immediately want to relieve that pain. When we see a child that is brutalized or bleeding, we are not only moved to compassion, but we are moved to action. When we see, as I've seen, a child dying, motionless, unable to move, you're gripped by a sense of wanting to do something, wanting immediately to help that child, to do something to end the suffering that's happened. But shouldn't we also be as angry about the denial of opportunity in education, about the talent that is wasted, about the potential that is unfulfilled, about the hopes that are being destroyed? You know, etched on my mind is a visit I made to Tanzania a few years ago. And I went to a town meeting in Tanzania, and they called hundreds of people together from that vicinity to talk about the challenges facing that area. And I had young boys coming up to me, begging for the chance to go to school. I had a woman who said to the meeting in front of all the elders, and particularly the senior men who were in that vicinity, that she'd had to turn to prostitution to pay for the education and health of her children. And I saw mothers who were no longer prepared to accept the elders, the men, running that village, and they spoke out and said, "It's about time you did something about education." And then I went to Nigeria, and I went to Abuja, and I went to visit a school in Abuja. And it so happened that Bono, the great pop singer who does so much for development, he also turned up at that school on that day. And we were talking to the children in the classroom, and we went round this classroom, and we were asking them what they wanted to do, what their careers wanted to be. And so we had people who wanted to be teachers and scientists and engineers and architects and everything you would expect in any classroom in any part of the world when children are given the freedom to talk about their aspirations and their ambitions and their hopes for the future. Bono was very surprised that nobody wanted to be a pop singer. I wasn't surprised that nobody wanted to be a politician. But you know, in that school, you knew immediately that their chances of being scientists and architects and engineers were almost nil. Because you had a school that was dilapidated, corrugated iron roofing that was falling apart, kids that were 3 to a desk, not enough books at all for them, no computers. And one of the things that I noticed was people were talking about another school up the road, not far away. And it was a school that was new and it had been built, but it had been built by an extremist religious sect. And the price was you could either have a bad school or you could have a good new school, but extremist dogma preached in it. And this is, I'm afraid, some of the choices that we face in education. We know from the experience of these children and their ambitions at that school in Abuja, the importance of education to jobs and to the economy. Professor Hanuchek at Stanford University has just finished a major study that shows that if you had universal education, then the growth per capita in the economy of that country would average 2% a year. So education is important for growth. The study also shows that for every $1 we spend on education, we get $15 back in the benefit to the economy. And we know that we're in a new world, and this is what your conference has been about, that you judge a company now, not by its physical capital, but by its intellectual capital. That you judge a country not by its reservoirs of mineral resources, but its reservoirs of human talent. We know also that the wealth of nations no longer depends, as Adam Smith used to say, on trade, but it depends on the quality and the intellectual capability and the knowledge and skill and the training and the education of millions of people in that country. And we know that if we are marching on behalf of education for all, we are marching not just for education for all, we are marching for prosperity for all. And we know, because education, as we've just heard in the last session, is so important to individual autonomy, that when we march for education for all, we're not just marching for education for all, we're marching for liberty and freedom for all. And we know, because of the importance that we attach to equality of opportunity in education, that when we march for education for all, we're not just marching for education, but for equality for all. And if we listen to Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum about the capabilities and how we can increase people's capabilities, and that's the desire of people, or should be the desire of people in public policy, then we're marching not just for education, but for dignity for all. And we know, as people concerned with education, that education unlocks opportunities not just in education, but in every other area. And we know that, for example, a girl who is at school is far less likely to marry young, far less likely to have a child that dies in childbirth, far less likely to contract HIV/AIDS, far more likely to be able to work, far more likely to be able to escape poverty as a result of that. And we know that our education goal, the Millennium Development Goal of education for all, will reduce child poverty, reduce maternal mortality, reduce infant mortality, reduce HIV/AIDS, reduce the lack of economic opportunity that exists in so many countries, reduce poverty, and therefore it is something as a goal that can actually change not just education, but change the rest of the world. A goal that unlocks opportunity in every area. And therefore, I want to make a plea today about a plan that we need to take us from here to 2015. Not to give up on the idea that in 4 years' time we could have every child at school. We know it is now impossible, I'm afraid, to achieve the Millennium Development Goal that would cut infant mortality by half. We are too far away. We know tragically it's impossible, despite all the changes, to change a situation where 350,000 mothers are dying each year from maternal mortality. It will not change quickly enough, even as the figures go down, to meet that Millennium Development Goal. We know we have not achieved the Millennium Development Goal on gender equality, and we should not give up on any of these. But there is one goal that we can achieve if we work hard and change policy and make sure that everybody is mobilized to that effort. We can achieve the Millennium Development Goal on education by 2015. And we can reinforce in people's minds that when the world makes a promise, it is not a promise that is casually set aside and betrayed for millions of children of future generations, but a promise that we do everything in our power to keep. Now, the first thing we have to do is to make sure that the funds that have been promised for education are made available. So all of us, in whatever area we work, should be pressing the Fast Track Initiative, and Carol Bellamy is doing an excellent job and is here this week talking about it, to make sure that the replenishment of the World Bank's fund and the Fast Track Initiatives Fund on education happens in the next few days. I would like to see 2 to 3 billion pledged, but even if it is less, we must do everything in our power to make that happen. We must hold national governments to their promises to provide the funding, both in development aid and, of course, the funding that individual developing countries' governments have promised for education in their own areas. And where countries fall behind, we should be telling them that this is not acceptable, because it is not simply about them and their generation, it is about future generations. But we should do more. In my view, we should now create a global fund for education. In the same way that we have a global fund for health, that has made enormous advances in tuberculosis and HIV/AIDS and vaccination, and of course in polio and malaria. We should have what we don't have at the moment, a global fund for education. And that would allow people in the private sector and the public sector, philanthropists and people in charities, private companies to affiliate and make possible there being a focus for momentum to 2015. And in my view, and you will have your views on this as well, there are three priorities as we move forward. The first, of course, is there is an infrastructure gap. And there are many classrooms that have not been built, promised but not yet there. I went to Mozambique and saw kids on 4 different sessions a day. So you came at 6 to 9, or 9 to 12, or 12 to 3, or 3 to 6, and if it got dark before 6, that was tough luck. You weren't going to get any education. We need to build the classrooms that are needed. We need private-public funding in an infrastructure fund, particularly for Africa, but also for parts of Asia, to make sure the classrooms are built. We need, secondly, to make sure that we benefit, and Jimmy Wells will say something about this later, benefit from the modern technology that is available that allows us to get information, knowledge, and educational materials to the poorest part of the poorest country because of new technology, and enable people not to be left behind, but to benefit from the advances of technology. And I want all the technology companies, the Microsofts, the Apples, the Facebooks, the Googles, to be involved in this project. If they have a worldwide vision, as we have, about the importance of education, then they should, as Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the internet, has said, make it possible for not 20% of the world to benefit from the internet, but 100% to benefit from the new technologies, including the web and the internet, that are available. And then the third thing we've got to do is make good the gap in teachers. We are 1.8 million short of the teachers we need if we've got any chance of meeting the Millennium Development Goals. And we heard last night about some amazing projects, distance learning, teaching, training on the ground, BRAC itself in Bangladesh, training teachers not just for Bangladesh but for Afghanistan. But we are short of teachers, and we need to move faster in teacher training and increasing the status, the quality, and the expertise available, and the support for teachers. And we know now also that a good school depends on a good leader of a school. And Wendy Koch will tell you about Teach for America, that the 400 schools that are doing best, schools in low-income areas that are getting the standards of the highest income areas in the United States, are schools that have got the best leaders, many of them from Teach for America in the first place. And so we need to concentrate on a plan not simply for teachers, but for leaders who are teachers, so that the new schools that are opened and built, and the momentum that we provide, leads to a teaching revolution as well. But we also know we have other problems that are not simply educational problems to address. There are 300 million children who are working today when most of them should be at school. And I have marched with Kailash, who is the leader of the Indian movement, to get children off the streets and out of child labour and into school. And I've seen children working when they should be at school. I went to Kibera in Nigeria, in Kenya, the greatest slum, they say, in the world. But in the middle of it, as you know, maybe, there is a great school which is an oasis of learning in the middle of this slum. And children are at school learning free of charge. Kenya made education free. 1 million children queued up to register for school in one of the greatest moments, I think, in educational history, when you see 1 million children in 1 week able to register for school for the first time. But as I left Kibera and as I left that slum, I saw a young girl, probably 6 or 7, and she wasn't at school because she was still working. And child labour is completely unacceptable in a world of 2011, where we know the cost of that, and we know also the damaging and deteriorating conditions in which these children are working, and child labour has got to be eliminated. And part of the campaign for education for all must be that those children who are working full-time, who are sent by their families to earn money, we must learn from those successful projects in Mexico and Brazil and Bangladesh, many projects that show that by conditional cash transfers you can get children into school. I think the second area where we know outside the school we've got to act is the cultural disadvantages that girls face. And it is quite unacceptable that the majority of children not at school today are girls. And we've got to deal, as the elders led by Nelson Mandela are dealing with, the problems of child brides, of children being forced into marriage at the age of 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. 1 in every 7 girls in the developing world are child brides before the age of 15. And some of you have seen what the elders have shown us. Pictures of a girl called Bibi, Pakistan, floods last year, forced into marriage because the family was in such poverty, to a 35-year-old, ending up dying in childbirth, too young. The girl called Rem, in another country which needs help, Yemen, 12 years old, sold into marriage. Not acceptable in the modern world, and it's time to act. And then we've got to recognize the problems of orphans, 17 million AIDS orphans deprived of school in many cases, 100 million orphans around the world. And then the problems of disabled children. I went to Africa and I met this young girl called Miriam. I will never forget that meeting, because we met not in a school, because she wasn't at school. We met in a field with a group of orphans who met every week thanks to a charity. She had been shunted from home to home because she was an orphan, but she was also disabled. Her mother had died of AIDS, and then her father had died of AIDS. She had contracted HIV. She had tuberculosis. And you know, if you see a girl of 12, you expect hope in their eyes. You expect expectation, ambition, aspiration, that things are going to happen, and they're excited about the future. You know that song, "And in her eyes I saw nothing"? No sign of joy behind the tears. Miriam, at the age of 12, desolate, no hope. We have got to change that. And then child soldiers and children in conflict. To Sheikha Moses' credit, she has led this campaign to make sure that children in this world who are in situations of conflict have also the right to education. Some of you may have visited Rwanda, and some of you here may be from Rwanda. But in the Children's Museum in Rwanda, there are pictures and stories about some of the children who lived through and were victims of the Holocaust in Rwanda in the 1990s. And go to one of these pictures, and when you see it and hear what is said, it will never leave you. And there's only a few words that explains what happened, side by side with this picture. And it says David, and it says age 10, ambition to be a doctor, favorite sport, football, favorite pastime, making people laugh, death by mutilation. Last words, the United Nations are coming to help us. That young child, in his idealism and in his innocence, was saying to his mother, it was his mother he was talking to, who also died, in these last few minutes, that the United Nations were coming to help him. He believed in his innocence and idealism, that where there was a conflict and a genocide, we, the rest of the world, had a duty to help and come to his support. He felt that in time we would be there to help him, and we never were, and we never were going to, and it never happened. And think not only of the children who died in conflict, but think of the children who are child soldiers forced into this conflict. And think of a time in your life when you want to play with your friends, and instead you're fighting your friends and others, that you're brutalized in war, never to be the same again. And there are 300,000 children we know in the world who are in these situations of conflict, denied education, forced into conflict when they should be at school. Instead they are soldiers or fighting in a conflict area. Now, we have made huge advances because under the Children's Conventions, we have made it absolutely clear that any country that forces children into being child soldiers and denies them the possibility of a childhood could be brought before the criminal court. But we have not yet created what we've done for health. We don't have the equivalent of an educational Red Cross in most countries. We don't have the equivalent of an educational Médecins Sans Frontières. We don't have what you might call the responsibility to educate alongside the responsibility to protect. We don't have people accepting that there are areas in a country where education, even in a broken down state, should continue. And the world is still based on this idea that what happens behind borders is acceptable if it's happening under the aegis of a national sovereign government. Instead, as people who believe in the Millennium Development Goal but believe in the right of every child to education, we must create a situation where every child, even in a broken down state, has the right to education, and we should perhaps consider what more we could do together as organizations to make it possible for teachers to be able to flourish and educate even in these situations where there is terrible conflict going on, and where the different sides of that conflict should agree that education is as important as health, and we should be in a position where education can continue. So yes, problems outside education, child soldiers, child labour, child brides, disabled children denied rights, orphans denied even the parents that are necessary to encourage them to be in education and to get the benefits of teaching. Why am I confident that we can do this despite all these obstacles? In 1946, just after the Second World War, when Europe was in ruins, Albert Camus, who, as you know, was a great French Algerian philosopher, met Jean-Paul Sartre, the great existentialist, André Malraux, the culture minister of France, and Arthur Koestler, who wrote Darkness at Noon. And this group of 4 people, Simone de Beauvoir, 5 people, they were talking about the future of the world. And Albert Camus said, "Didn't we get it all wrong? Didn't we make a mistake when we said there was no such thing as moral values? Shouldn't we admit that we got it wrong? And if we were to say that there are such a thing as moral values, then would that not be the beginning of hope?" And when I look around the world, and I look at every single religion of the world, and each of these religions has exactly the same golden rule, the same obligation on individuals to do something to help their fellow citizens, then that's what gives me hope that not only can this Millennium Development Goal be met, but we can unite together to achieve huge change as part of common purpose. Take each of the golden rules. Do to others as you would be done by. Do not do what is hateful to others. Do not do what is hurtful to others. Treat others as you will be treated. Each of these golden rules, Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, Buddha, Christian, Judaism, all saying exactly the same thing. And I believe that's what we build upon. A sense upon each of us that we are global citizens with responsibilities to each other. So that's why I believe that we should devise a plan to take us to 2015, based on the belief that people who are global citizens will want, as a minimum, to ensure that every child is in education. So what we want to do is form a global business coalition for education so that every company is interested, every major company plays a part in achieving this Millennium Development Goal. A global faith coalition for education so that every church and every faith group, and 1/3 of children are educated by faith groups in Africa, are involved in achieving these goals. A global parents group, a global teachers group. We must force the pace so that we are in a position to raise awareness and create a momentum that pressurizes the governments of the world to change. And we must use every form of mass media and every form of entertainment to make sure that message gets across. And yes, I've asked Kevin Ward, who did Live Earth, and Simon Fuller, who has been involved in American Idol, can we organize events around the world that are global events that can raise the profile of education and make sure that people know, whether they are a young person listening to mass entertainment or people listening to poetry or reading books, they know that this is a goal that has got to be achieved. Some of you may remember, and some of you may have since read, the great famous inauguration address that John F. Kennedy, the President of America, made in 1961. And a few months ago, I was asked, as part of a project, to re-record that speech with different voices from people from different continents of the world, to record one part of that speech as others recorded other parts. And you remember the great words of that speech: the torch has passed to a new generation, which is what we're trying to do with education. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. This great call to public service that every teacher and every educationist is part of. Never negotiate from fear, never fear to negotiate. This idea that security through cooperation is absolutely central to the world. If we cannot help the many who are poor, we cannot save the few who are rich. A call for fairness in the distribution of resources. And I was asked, you may know that Richard Nixon, who was the defeated candidate for president, was asked which of these words in Kennedy's speech, of all the great words in the whole speech, would he like to record? He said there was only one: I hereby accept the office of President of the United States of America. I was asked to record one, and it is: united, there is nothing that we cannot do. Divided, we shall surely fail. And then it goes on to say, we have it in our power, in our mortal power, to end poverty and hunger, conflict, and also illiteracy. I think that's a great challenge for the modern world. I think we are in a position, as a group of educationists, teachers, NGOs, people concerned as businesses about education, to make that huge difference. We need now a plan for 2015, a plan that is about teachers, about infrastructure, about technology, a plan that identifies the great gaps that have got to be bridged and how we deal with the problems of child labour, child brides, and we deal with the problem of children who are disabled and what we do about them, and child soldiers. But we also need to bring the world together to create a momentum about education that is equivalent to the momentum we have on health and on other very, very important issues for our world. Robert Frost, the famous American poet, wrote a poem called The Road Not Taken. And that poem was written just at the time of 1914, 1915, and he actually wrote it, although he was American, when he was in England. And it's: two roads converged in a wood. I took the one less travelled by, and it made all the difference. And everybody who read that Robert Frost poem said, this is a poem about destiny. This is a poem about how you can sit here today, make a decision that will change your life and then potentially change the world. And Robert Frost kept saying to people, I didn't mean it that way. I didn't mean it to be a poem of destiny. You could have taken the other road and it might have worked out quite happily. I didn't mean it to be like that. And then a friend of his, who was a colleague, another poet, read the poem and immediately decided in 1914 he was going to conscript for the war effort and not leave for America. And even his friend, it had a huge effect on him, making a decision despite what Robert Frost said. So no matter what Robert Frost could do about this poem, people read into it because people are like that. We want to read into it this way, that there are situations where you make decisions, and when you make these decisions, it can make all the difference. That there is such a thing as destiny, and there is such a thing as choices, and by making these choices, we can change the world. We are at that moment of truth in education. I know the plans that many of you have for innovation and for transformation. These plans are absolutely massive for the future, and education is at that turning point. Between now and 2015, we've got a momentous challenge. We have to prove that we can awaken the world to the need that every child in the 21st century should be at school. We have the opportunity to do it. We can make all the difference. When Cicero spoke, the great Roman senator spoke in Rome, and he made these brilliant speeches before the Senate, people turned to each other and said, great speech. But when Demosthenes, who was a great Greek orator, spoke in ancient Greece, and after he finished, people turned to each other, they didn't say great speech. They said, let's march. And we should be marching for education for all. It is the task of this generation. Think of it this way. For the whole of the history of the world until now, we have developed only some of the talents of some of the people. We have the chance, if we deliver education for all, to develop for the first time the talents, all the talents of all of the people. We can be the first generation in history to deliver for every child the right that they should have had long ago, that every child shall have the chance of education. Let's march to do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brown. A great speech, and let's march as well. Just two things I picked up amongst many great points made: a global business coalition for education and a global fund for education.